On January 18th, I received an email from the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association calling clergy to Minneapolis for a day of prayer, fasting, and solidarity on Friday, January 23rd, to protest the ongoing ICE surge and the inhumane treatment, not just of immigrants, but anyone with brown skin and anyone who tried to stand up against and document peacefully ICE's actions. I decided not to go, in part because I had a busy week with work and family here. I would have had to reschedule and find backup coverage, including for Sunday worship. In part because I am 62 years old, living with ME/CFS, aka chronic fatigue syndrome. And while my case is relatively mild, such a trip would significantly deplete my energy. And in part, if I'm honest, because I was scared. I felt guilty about that last one because I believe Dr. King was right. Nothing will change until people of goodwill put their bodies and souls into motion. What is happening in Minneapolis and Chicago and Portland and Los Angeles and now in Maine is not just a political crisis, and it's not even just a moral crisis. It's a spiritual crisis, a reckoning and a struggle for the soul of our country, with each escalation of tactics meant to intimidate and to divide, to slowly build our tolerance for what is unacceptable, immoral. Our souls are being worn down, along with our capacity for compassion and hope. Still, I made the decision I made, and I looked for other ways to support my colleagues who were going. I sent money to offset travel costs, and I sent money to support the organization that was planning the event. I reached out to the Reverends Justine Sullivan and Jennifer Johnston, our two former rock star interns, because of course they were going, along with others I knew would be there, and I stayed in touch with them by text while they were in Minneapolis, sending prayers of strength and warmth because it was cold. Then on January 20th, I received another email, this one from the Clergy Caucus of the Massachusetts Communities Action Network, inviting me to a gathering in Boston in solidarity with the folks in Minneapolis on January 23rd. We would attend a prayer service by Zoom with clergy in Minnesota and then walk to the State House to deliver a letter to the governor asking Massachusetts not to cooperate with federal actions that violently targeted immigrant and vulnerable communities. Again, I felt reluctant for all the same reasons I didn't go to Minnesota, but I attended the preparatory Zoom meeting and heard from the pastor of a bilingual congregation in Minneapolis. And what they shared was terrifying and heartbreaking. Federal agents treating human beings with disdain, as well as force, creating fear for anyone with brown skin, not just immigrants, but citizens. It was also inspiring, though, to learn how congregations, community groups, and individuals were responding to care for the vulnerable parishioners and neighbors. It's amazing. When someone asked the pastor how they were able to respond so quickly with these complex networks, the pastor said, "When we saw what was happening in Chicago, we reached out to them to learn what they were doing because we knew it could happen here. It could happen to you. My advice, learn from us, prepare now." That was when I realized that as much as I lacked the time and energy and as anxious and as afraid as I might be, going to the prayer service in Boston was a way to put my body and soul, my faith in what I believe is sacred and holy, into motion. So I went. Over 200 clergy and faith leaders gathered at the Cathedral of St. Paul, which is really quite remarkable when you think we got the email on a Tuesday and we were there on a Friday. Cathedral of St. Paul across the Boston Common. Of course, there was a strong Unitarian Universalist presence. You'd think we were like this huge religion. As well as representatives from a wide range of Christian denominations and Jewish, Muslim, and Buddhist leaders. And I was heartened to see how many of the clergy were young. I mean, to me, young. Anyway, I mean, I think I won't go there. The prayer service led by the clergy in Minneapolis, which we attended on Zoom, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. An evangelical pastor from a Latino congregation teared up as he described the fear that his community is living under, the disruption to their daily lives, as he felt that ICE was trying to erase them all from the city. A Buddhist priestess reminded us that whatever our religious tradition or none, we share a moral clarity around love, that loving our neighbor is a holy practice. A leader from the Massachusetts Clergy Caucus offered a sobering reminder that what is happening was not imposed upon the country, but voted in. Trump was clear about what he wanted to do, and he's doing it. A majority of the voters, however slim that margin might be, chose this, whether they believed it would happen or not. And there were also those who didn't vote, and to me, that's a choice. The only long-term way to turn this around, to change hearts and minds, is to love our neighbors, even as we organize or protest. Because we're not going to change things in Washington, at least not quickly. Dee and I were talking before the service about how government time is even slower than church. After the service at the cathedral, we were asked to find someone we didn't know and introduce ourselves through a series of questions, one of which was, how has this moment challenged or deepened your faith? I partnered with Hannah, a rabbinic student at Hebrew Union. She's from New Orleans, so of course we bonded immediately. I told her about our 10 years traveling down there to help rebuild after Hurricane Katrina, how much I love that city. She told me about growing up in that complicated and beautiful place. When I asked her how old she was when Katrina hit, she said she was 6. But it was the trauma of that time and the role that her faith community played in getting through it that has led her to become a rabbi. When Hannah asked how this moment has challenged or deepened my faith, I shared my family's history in Poland under Hitler, as well as how I finally traveled there in 2024, visiting the death camp where my grandfather was taken, and meeting cousins across generations. The older ones had not only survived war, but communism. The younger ones were growing up under a more democratic government. I told Hannah about neighbors who risked everything during the war. Mrs. Devich, hiding my mother and grandmother and great-grandmother in her attic. Father Zameko falsifying a baptismal certificate so my mother could pass as Catholic instead of Jewish. These individuals put their bodies and souls in motion through acts of civil disobedience, not only because they thought the laws were immoral, but to help their neighbors, people they knew and had relationships with. And you have to understand, to break the law in that moment was to risk prison, a concentration camp, execution. What is happening in our country is not the same as what happened under Hitler in the 30s and 40s. We are ways away from that. But many observers have noted that there are family resemblances. Racial profiling and scapegoating, detention of vulnerable members of minority groups, including children and elders, heavily armed, masked, government agents acting without due process or accountability, harassments, threats, and even killing of those who challenge or attempt to protect those being targeted. So I wonder if we're approaching a moment when similar acts of courage are required. Stories of mutual aid networks arising quietly to help people afraid to leave their homes in cities already impacted have me thinking about what might be needed beyond protests. There are other forms of faithful resistance than protesting, and these require a commitment of time and energy and resources to sustain. The murder of Alex Preddy last Saturday forced both the Senate and the administration to slow things down a little with regard to ICE funding and actions, yet they are continuing to operate across the country, including here in Massachusetts. They have been all along, and Lowell is already affected. The governor recently signed executive orders limiting cooperation with the agency. Maybe a surge won't come here. Maybe it won't happen, but I'm trying to hold realism together with hope. As I said, this is more than a political or moral crisis, it is a soul crisis. And after listening to the clergy from Minneapolis, I believe that what is happening is not just wrong, it's evil. I do not use that word lightly or often. I'm trying to remember the last time I said that word from the pulpit. And I do not use it to demonize or to give up on anyone's humanity. Instead, evil speaks to me about how all this impacts our souls, how it dehumanizes everyone, victims, perpetrators, observers. As Unitarian Universalists, we claim Henry David Thoreau as one of our prophets. His essay, Civil Disobedience, that Terry read part of, shapes our tradition's commitment to the right of conscience. Thoreau insisted that citizens resist legal but immoral laws like enslavement, genocide, imperial war. Dr. King, the second reading, worked closely with Unitarian Universalist ministers during the Civil Rights Movement, or I should say UU ministers worked with him since he was leading it. Dr. King deepened Thoreau's insight. Civil disobedience was more than an individual choice, but a religious communal response. Resisting unjust laws not only because they violate conscience, but because they violate the holy. They violate a love larger than us that spans generations and traditions. So I've been asking, how do I get ready? How do I help us get ready? How do we prepare to put our bodies and souls into motion? My colleague, the Reverend Kim Debus, wrote honestly about why she did not go to Minneapolis. She pointed out that not everyone is called to the front lines. And even if that was our call once upon a time, it can shift. And she directed me to this year's UUA Common Read, Social Change Now by Deepa Iyer, which names many of the roles for individuals and communities working for justice. In addition to protest and frontline responders, also caregivers, healers, storytellers, guides, weavers, visionaries, and more. So part of our soul work is discerning our role and honoring it. The joy for me in all of this is being reminded that I don't have to do it myself, that there are several ways to engage in faithful resistance that match both my gifts and my limitations. I have colleagues all over the state and country, Unitarian Universalist and others, who are engaged in this too, and they have congregations like ours who are doing the same, and I have all of you, and we have one another. So I invite you to reflect on the question that Hannah and I shared in the Cathedral of St. Paul. How has this moment challenged or deepened your Unitarian Universalist faith? Given that, how are you called to put your body and soul into motion? To love all your neighbors, those whose lives are at risk, and those whose fear or anger or indifference help sustain that risk. How do we make this nation a great nation? As Dr. King said, through compassion, with dignity and freedom for all. Whatever role we are called to, we do not do this work alone, and we can't do it all at once. But let us keep walking and looking toward that growing edge.